Welcome to the Hollywood Scholar. I'm Jed Morgan, and today we're plunging headfirst into The Witcher: Sirens of the Deep, Netflix's latest attempt to expand the Witcher universe. And by expand, I mean it chose to teach its audience that hashtag mermaid lives matter, fish Pocahontas is always right, and most importantly, that when your kingdom needs you the most to keep the peace, you should abandon it, leave a bigoted king in charge, and just hope for the best. Truly, I have been enlightened. Thank you, Netflix. As you might be able to tell from my voice, this film quite literally made me sick, but we'll muddle through. Kidding aside, this animated film is, by default, the best adaptation of The Witcher that Netflix has thus far coughed up. Unlike the live-action show, Geralt is not mocked, berated, or demoted to a glorified sidekick in his own story. In Sirens of the Deep, he actually manages to slay the villain and shockingly drive much of the narrative. That said, Nightmare of the Wolf, which had no direct source material, still outshined Sirens of the Deep, as it featured compelling enough characters struggling with semi-interesting challenges. Now, does all of this mean that Sirens of the Deep is actually good? Far from it. It's simply an improvement on the horrendous status quo that Lauren Hissrich and Tomek McGinski have fostered at Netflix. In truth, Sirens of the Deep adapts a little sacrifice, much like my colon adapts dinner. Some of the pieces are still there, but it's a bit shitty now. As a longtime fan of the Witcher novels and short stories, I could spend hours dissecting how Sirens of the Deep took a little sacrifice and watered it down, much like a reverse Jesus.
Disgusting. I want a better life.
But fear not, my sadistic friends, I plan to wade in and break down the differences in another video very soon. That said, here I will address a solitary item in this vein. It does not take more than a basic understanding of fantasy or mythology, things that all fantasy creators should be familiar with, to know that sirens and mermaids are entirely different things. The film itself manages to get it right, calling them mermaids, mermen, and merpeople. Not once are they referred to as sirens, and yet the title couldn't remain consistent with the story it represents. This, among other reasons I'll explore later, is why I believe this film should have been marketed as Disney Wannabe Studios presents Normal Eyes and the Mermaids of Deep ripoff. As always, be forewarned, spoilers ahead. The plot of Sirens of the Deep is much like a hodgepodge of classic Disney films, Aquaman, and Game of Thrones, but without the charm, the intrigue, or anything remotely engaging. Geralt of Rivia and his trusty and ever more effeminate sidekick Jaskier, desperate and hungry, take a job to find and eliminate the monster-threatening pearl divers in a seaside kingdom. Only, all is not as it seems. This is not a simple hunt, but the prelude to something far worse. Deeply rooted prejudices between the humans and the submerged Mer Kingdom propel both sides towards an ever-nearing war. Tagging along as the Witcher attempts to forestall a war is Jaskier's childhood friend, Essie, who immediately becomes infatuated with Geralt. Meanwhile, the prince has fallen in love with a mermaid princess, one whom he is incapable of communicating with. As tensions rise, more divers are slain and fearsome fishmen, the Vodnik, stalk Geralt and company, hoping to eliminate their meddling. All is revealed when Geralt discovers a mermaid royal necklace in the wreckage of a destroyed pearl diver ship that implicates the Mer Princess's aunt, a sea witch named Melusina, who assumed the form of a kraken to commit the murders. Years ago, the sea witch loved the Mer King, but he married her sister instead because the sea witch was barren. So, naturally, she swore revenge, allied herself with the Human King, and spent her time orchestrating a war to wipe out her own family and steal the throne. Meanwhile, the Human King is working with her because he really enjoys murdering mermaids? Yeah? Just when you think their plight couldn't get any worse, the king, because he's evil now and can only do evil things once he's been revealed, orders the execution of his own bastard son for condemning the king's actions. The bastard, alongside Geralt and Jaskier, are to be sacrificed to the sea before the first battle of the war begins. In the confusion of the fighting, the captives escape and the sea witch transforms into a kraken to slaughter all. But fear not. The mermaid princess, her human prince, Geralt and friends team up to slay the beast, bringing about an extremely sudden peace between the two worlds. And then, just to subvert the source material and make the man rather than the woman sacrifice something, the love-struck prince, who now totally understands how wrong his people were, chooses to not stay in the royal palace, where he might actually help guide his kingdom towards tolerance and a better future. No, that would make sense. Instead, he chugs the Sea Witch's potion, which could have turned his beloved mermaid into a human, transforming himself into a merman instead. The human king, understandably outraged, is then just told to forgive and forget, because reasons. And thus the tale ends on a supposedly happy note, despite none of the major problems actually being resolved. For all its bloated and padded runtime, Sirens of the Deep does manage to present a few positives. Chief among them, the return of Doug Cockle, reprising his role as Geralt from the Witcher video games. Despite the attempts made to meld his version of the character with Henry Cavill's, adding in many more sighs and whispered profanity, it was still a treat to hear this man work. Few voice actors have come to embody their roles as thoroughly as Doug has. I wish him nothing but luck, and hope more chances arise for him to play the role, hopefully in better written stories that actually deserve him. Now, I fully acknowledge that I come into any Witcher adaptation with a degree of bias due to my love for the source material. Admitting that, I completely understand why many audience members unfamiliar with the Witcher books may find Sirens of the Deep passable. It isn't offensively terrible, at least not in the way that The Witcher Season 3 was, but it leans far more on spectacle than on any meaningful substance. Casual viewers may prefer the spectacle and enjoy the film as such. Sirens of the Deep offers palatable enough normie nib that it will likely be received generally positively, at least by the handful of people who are still interested, let alone invested, in Netflix's Witcher universe. For a film that barely scrapes an hour and a half, Sirens of the Deep somehow manages to feel bloated. Much of that comes down to relentless padding, scenes and subplots so superficial that they may as well not exist. If you're going to take a 60-page short story and expand it into a feature-length film, at least take the time to meaningfully explore the ideas you introduce instead of just shoving them in for runtime. Otherwise, what's the point? The worst examples of this pointless padding are the Yennefer flashbacks and visions. We already know Geralt is pining after her. We already know he feels bad for leading Essie on. We do not need random dream sequences to hammer it home. It doesn't add anything new and only serves to remind us that the writers don't trust the audience to pick up on basic subtext. Then we have the mermaid politics, which are about as deep as a splash pool. The Sea Witch is bitter because she's barren? The humans are evil because humans bad? Somehow in an economy based primarily on pearl divers, when these divers, look for pearls, they're extraordinarily greedy? That's what makes the humans evil in this? The mermaids act as if pearl diving threatens their way of life and endangers their people. There are no references to humans actually hurting mermaids or any other sea creatures while pearl diving. It's not like oysters are their primary food source or even one at all either. That is as deep as the mermaid politics get, even though we spend countless minutes of runtime on it. The love story between the Mer Princess and the Prince, which could have driven the political discussions much like Romeo and Juliet, is so erratic that it could be used as a case study for unstable relationships. One minute she adores him, the next she remembers that he's human and therefore evil, then she's back to loving him again for no discernible reason. We're expected to care about this romance, but it's so hollow that even Twilight's love triangles have more emotional weight. Because this is a modern day production by talentless creators, of course, everything has to be connected. Jaskier just happens to have grown up in this random kingdom. Essie just so happens to be his childhood best friend. His childhood bully just so happens to be the king's bastard, who then just so happens to save them at the end. At this point, it's less interwoven storytelling and more small world syndrome on steroids. Characters just know things with no explanation. The humans somehow have extensive knowledge on mermaid politics and abilities, despite the fact that almost no one speaks their language and their two peoples have almost no interaction. Geralt, who has never visited this kingdom before, immediately deduces that a random royal necklace that they've found must only belong to a single sea witch? And while we're on the topic of logic, let's talk about the Sea Witch's master plan, which is about as airtight as a sunken ship. She wants the humans to believe that the mer people sent Vodnik, scary fishmen, to kill the pearl divers. She has Vodnik in her service, but instead of using them, she personally transforms into a kraken and stabs spears through the bottom of the ship in the most obviously non-Vodnik way possible? Worse, she doesn't even use her tentacles above water, which we see her do later, to at least make it look like Vodnik did this. If you're trying to frame someone, maybe don't make it blatantly clear that a different monster committed the crime. Now, let's address the fishy elephant in the room. How do mermaids bone? As my good friend Adam the Renaissance nerd pointed out...
You know what? There is a single reason why I wouldn't want to become a merman. I wouldn't have my penis anymore.
The film straight up admits that the prince and merprincess have been together. But how? The original short story makes it clear that mermaids lay eggs and don't have human-compatible anatomy. Yet they somehow did it in the anime film? This diminishes the need to swap species at the end. Talking about the prince, no one seems to think through him becoming a merman. The concept of a little sacrifice is butchered by this change. In the short story, the mer princess becomes human to prevent war between the two species, placing herself beside the man who could declare war to influence him away from it. In this version, the prince was literally the one human in the kingdom who had a shot at influencing the king towards peace, and then someday becoming king himself. Yet he ignores this to become a merman without a second thought. The film never addresses how this might restart the war, despite the fact that it was the entire premise of the movie. Netflix once again sacrificed logic, consistency, and good storytelling for the message. The majority of the acting in Sirens of the Deep, especially Essie's, was extraordinarily flat, as if the actors were not invested in their roles or the project. Essie was either unemotional or angry, with zero in between. The animation depicted a wider variety of emotions, yet the performance never portrayed the same. Also, adding her family into the narrative for emotional stakes was painfully cliche. It's almost as if the writers did not trust the audience to believe that someone could be invested in stopping a war unless they had a personal investment in those fighting in it. A well-written character does not need personal stakes to be invested in a conflict. As an aside, Essie's character in the short story is described as, for in her agreeable and pretty, but otherwise unremarkable, little face shone a huge, beautiful, shining dark blue eye, which riveted the gaze. Essie Davin's other eye was largely covered and obscured by a golden curl, which fell onto her cheek. While Netflix retained Essie's nickname of Little Eye and included the golden curl over her one eye, they chose to animate her with incredibly mundane eyes that do not fit the name nor the reaction to them. They are as normal as eyes can come. I don't blame the actors involved for these poor performances, at least for the most part. They were given very little to work with. The dialogue was exposition heavy, constantly reinforcing to the audience the supposed themes and relationships, or was downright bizarre. My favorite of which is this interaction at the beginning of the film when it is revealed through stunning writing that the Sea Witch is barren.
Not that you could ever understand the depth of a mother's love for her child.
Did she just call her barren?
Carrying on in the tradition of The Witcher Season 3, Sirens of the Deep continues to take far more inspiration from other properties rather than its source material. Here are some of my favorite examples. In the end, Sirens of the Deep is yet another example of modern Hollywood's obsession with rehashing existing stories while gutting them of their original depth and meaning. While it may be the least offensive Witcher adaptation Netflix has produced, that's hardly a compliment. The film is riddled with unnecessary padding, laughable logic gaps, and half-baked characters who only exist to drive home the same tired, human bad narrative. Geralt, for once, isn't entirely sidelined, but that's the bare minimum requirement for adapting a story about him. For those unfamiliar with A Little Sacrifice, Sirens of the Deep may be a passable, if forgettable, animated film with some decent action, Doug Cockle's return being the biggest highlight of the film. But for anyone who cares about The Witcher's lore, themes, and characters, or who wants better written stories in general, Sirens of the Deep is just another soulless, shallow attempt to pander to a broad audience while fundamentally misunderstanding the material it's adapting. But anyway, that's all I have for today. Please like, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video. Anon.